Welcome to Native America Calling. I'm Sean Spruce. Julian Brave Noisecat's relationship with his father marks the starting point for his first book that is part memoir and part journalistic illumination of shared Indigenous history. We Survived the Night picks up where his Oscar-nominated documentary Sugarcane leaves off, exposing hidden truths that offer a secret to healing. We'll hear from Julian Brave Noisecat about his work, his family, and powwow dancing, coming up right after the news.
This is National Native News. I'm Antonia Gonzalez. The government shutdown is creating a lot of uncertainty and disruption for Native American and Alaska Native communities and for tribal organizations that administer federal programs. These include SNAP for food assistance and the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, which subsidizes energy bills. Ben Malott, president of the Alaska Federation of Natives, told the Senate Indian Affairs Committee Wednesday that the prospect that both of these programs would run out of money just as winter begins puts some Alaskans in a life-threatening bind.
Without LIHEAP, without SNAP, our communities or tribal citizens will have to decide between fuel and food.
During the pandemic, the Federal Subsistence Board allowed emergency hunting to improve food security. Now with the government shut down, Malott says the Subsistence Board cannot even meet. More than 500 Indian land school districts are feeling financial stress too. Carrie Bird, president of the National Indian Education Association, says federal impact aid provides half the budget for some schools, and the shutdown is interrupting the flow.
In South Dakota, Montana, and New Mexico, school districts are burning through reserves just to meet payroll.
Bird says Head Start programs will run low on money if the shutdown extends into November. Witnesses say many agency experts tribes normally turn to have lost their jobs. Pete Upton testified about the Trump administration's plan to abolish a fund at the Treasury Department called the Community Development Financial Institutions Fund. Upton runs the Native CDFI network. He says tribal communities are often in banking deserts.
Native CDFIs are typically the only financial institutions serving these communities, providing access to capital, credit, and financial education where no alternative exists.
Early in the shutdown, the Treasury Department fired the entire staff at the CDFI fund. With no one at the federal office to certify CDFIs, Upton says it's hard for community finance organizations to attract private sector investment. Senator Lisa Murkowski, chair of the Indian Affairs Committee, says tribes face enormous uncertainty as the stalemate in Congress nears the 1-month mark.
We can't figure out the path forward right now on our spending bills, although I am a little bit more optimistic on that today.
She did not elaborate, but said earlier this week that senators are engaged in productive talks. The Navajo Nation has had 4 attorneys general in less than a year. And as KJZZ's Gabriel Pietrazio reports, one of them returns to that office amid a politically tense time in Window Rock, Arizona.
And we have a vote of 2 in favor, 19 opposed, with the speaker not voting. Main motion fails.
Colin Bradley was acting attorney general for less than 3 months, but the Navajo Nation Council wouldn't confirm him, forcing President Boo Nygren to tap his own chief of staff, Chris Beecher, yet again.
My hope is to bring that stability for the rest of the administration and allow the Department of Justice to have one last leader for the end of this term.
Bradley penned a pair of opinions tackling decades-old Diné legal disputes. One ruled that blood quantum, a controversial way to determine tribal membership, violates the Navajo Bill of Rights. He also deemed the Diné Marriage Act discriminatory and to immediately repeal it. That 2005 law bars recognition of same-sex marriage. But there's a debate whether his writings are null and void. As for Beecher,
there's long-standing precedent that any of the opinions that you wish still stand,
unless undone by the sitting Attorney General. For National Native News, I'm Gabriel Pietrazio.
And I'm Antonia Gonzalez.
National Native News is produced by Koahnic Broadcast Corporation, with funding by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Support by AARP, whose Family Caregiver Resource Guide is available to caregivers by calling 877-333-5885 or at aarp.org/caregiverresources. Support by Sonosky Chambers Law, championing tribal sovereignty and Native American rights since 1976. From opioids litigation to treaty rights to tribal self-governance. With offices in Washington, D.C., New Mexico, California, and Alaska. Sonosky Chambers Law.
Native Voice One, the Native American Radio Network.
This is Native America Calling. I'm Sean Spruce. Julian Brave Noisecat begins his new book with his father's first moments in the world. It's a harrowing story that follows his father throughout his life and offers a window into the author's own perspective on his identity. We'll hear about that coming up. We'll also learn more about Noisecat's family lineage, his personal musings on Native issues, and the importance of his people's early ancestor, the Coyote. The book, titled We Survived the Night, comes from a translation of his community's traditional morning greeting. This newly released book comes on the heels of his recent Oscar nomination for co-directing the 2024 documentary film Sugarcane. Today, we'll speak with Noisecat, whose other titles include journalist, policy analyst, and former champion powwow dancer. If you're familiar with his writing, we invite you to voice a comment or question by calling 1-800-996-2848. That number is also 1-800-99-NATIVE. Give us a call. We have the phone lines open now. Joining us on Zoom from Vancouver, British Columbia is Julian Brave Noisecat. He is the author of the new book, We Survived the Night. He is also a filmmaker and a student of Salish art and history. He is a member of Canam Lake Band First Nation. Julian, good morning. Welcome back to Native America Calling, and please feel free to further introduce yourself to our listeners.
Chuchwinoch, wait, chochwait up Julian Brave Noisecat, when Chechwa, so chochmach, and it's that live again, that's Aschen, which Dakwan, Latwin, Bubsman, chochwayucham to Ben Kuba. Hey everyone, my name is Julian Brave Noisecat, or as I literally said, good morning, you all survived the night. I'm Sequatmuch and Statliunk. I come from the Canam Lake Band in what is now British Columbia, Canada. Coming to you live from Vancouver, BC. Good to be on the airwaves with Native America Calling.
It's great to have you on the show, Julian. And I'm just glad we all survived the night and we're able to have this conversation with you right now, today. Now, this new book, you just have a lot going on here. You discuss topics ranging from Native treaty rights to powwow dancing. But of course, this relationship with your father, it is a thread throughout the whole book. It's a self-discovery story with a parent who you often describe as a coyote dad. Tell us more. What did writing this book help you understand about that connection?
Well, you know, I am a child of two worlds. My dad is a Secwepemc Statliunk artist. In fact, he lived in Santa Fe, New Mexico, the sort of mecca of Indian art for 15 years. You know, all the silver and turquoise in the world can be found in Santa Fe, right next to a painting of a Dene guy on a horseback in front of Monument Valley or something like that. And my mother is an Irish Jewish New Yorker, and if you hear her talk, she sounds the part. And you know, my dad left our family when I was about 6 years old to chase alcohol and Indian art world fame, and that left me with a lot of questions about my, you know, family that he connected me to, but that, you know, he left, my culture and my identity. You know, if you took a photo of me, my mom, and my dad, it would look like my dad's jeans kicked my mom's jeans butt. You know, and they gave me just about as Indian a name as you could give a little Indian kid, you know, Julian Brave Noisecat. Nobody reads that in the school attendance and is like, well, what's your ethnic background? And so, you know, I guess I've been on a lifelong journey, as many of us are, you know, even if we have two Native parents, to figure out what it is to be indigenous, to what indigeneity is, and to reconnect with and reclaim that, because for me it was, you know, nearly lost and broken at a young age.
Well, you're very open, and you share a lot of personal stories. Some of them really inspiring, exciting, happy, and others are sad. You know, they're tough to get through. But especially with regard to your father's difficulties, the book begins when he is found as an infant, alone in a garbage incinerator at a Canadian residential school. And you imagine in that first chapter what it might have been like for the person who discovered your dad as a newborn. Why was that important to take yourself and the readers there to that kind of anonymous? Well, ultimately, you find out who that person is, but why that character in specific?
Well, my dad was found on the campus of the St. Joseph's Mission near Williams Lake, British Columbia, on the night of August 16, 1959. The night watchman, a guy named Tony Stoop, who was a Dutch guy from the old country, he didn't speak very good English. He pulled his car up after coming from a meeting of the Knights of Columbus in Williams Lake, which is the cow town nearby. And he heard this sound, which he described to the local paper as being like the noise of a cat, which is a really crazy kind of coincidence, I would say. So he went investigating with his flashlight, and the sound led him to the trash incinerator at the back of St. Joseph's Mission, where inside he found a newborn baby in an ice cream carton. And that baby was called Baby X by the law enforcement authorities, and that was my father. Um, the story of the Indian residential schools is one that was so painful, carried so much shame and guilt and trauma that it's not one that my own family talked about. My grandmother, who was sent to St. Joseph's Mission, barely talks about what happened there, except for a couple stories. My father didn't know the story of his own birth and discovery until I set out to write We Survived the Night and to direct Sugarcane, the documentary about the investigation at St. Joseph's Mission. And for me, it's also an intergenerational story because, of course, my father was himself abandoned as a newborn, and then went on to have two kids who he also abandoned, which is, a story of intergenerational abandonment and trauma that is I think one that is similar and true for so many other Native people who were also impacted by, the Indian residential schools in Canada and the Native American boarding schools here in the United States.
Now, as you mentioned, your father was abandoned as an infant, but it's also important to note that he was ultimately reconnected with his biological family. So you did have that connection, which is so important. And this whole idea of being a coyote dad, because I think I can relate my dad was a coyote dad as well. And I think a
Yeah.
lot of people can relate to that. And tell us a little
A
bit more.
lot of
Like, what is
non-Indians can relate to
I
it
think,
too,
yeah,
honestly.
yeah, for sure. A lot of us can. I mean, it's just, but what does that mean? How would you, like, in one sentence, how would you, what is like the classic definition of a coyote dad?
Well, I guess I should probably explain who the coyote is just to start for that. To write this book, I made a fairly unusual decision, which was to move back in with my dad, who had left when I was 6 years old and who still owes me the money that I loaned him to come to my own high school graduation, just to give you a little flavor for the history that we share. Suddenly, we were living across the hallway from each other, cooking each other breakfast. He's an artist, so he'd be out in the garage, carving all day, rocking out to Led Zeppelin, taking rips from the bong, adzing away at a log. When my dad is making his art, just as an aside, I'm a bit envious of his process because it looks like a music video in his studio. Whereas, for me as a writer and a filmmaker, I'm like hunched over a laptop, like with a horrible posture, writer's back going on. Like I'm only 32 and yet I'm complaining about my back and my hips and my shoulders and all these things. And I had this idea, that the book would touch on some of my own people's oral history. And initially, I thought that would just be like a sort of surface level ornamentation to the text. And as I started reading, because I really did have to read these oral histories because they are not told by my own people anymore, the coyote stories in these 100-year plus old, anthropological texts on JSTOR and the internet, I started seeing all these similarities between my trickster forefather coyote, who was sent to the earth by creator to set things in order, And my father, this epic figure who, like the coyote, the trickster, was a bit of a trickster and also an abandoner and a survivalist. And I was kind of looking at the PDF over here on JSTOR, and then looking across the hallway at my roommate, my dad, and back at the PDF, and over at the roommate, my dad, and all of a sudden I was like, oh my God, like the trickster coyote is my father. There's a lot of elements of our trickster ancestor in him and in his father and in many of the men in my family and probably in myself as well. And that insight fundamentally transformed the book, and made me ask a question that I'd never seen asked of narrative nonfiction before. Would it be possible to take the coyote stories seriously as nonfiction in an art form that, has never done that for our oral histories?
You know what I really like about when you share the coyote stories, you write them in kind of a more relaxed, almost kind of a contemporary tone. Like a lot of times when we read these, these historical tales or these cultural stories, the wording, the vocabulary, the sentences, it sounds like very kind of old school, but you use like a lot of contemporary slang with the coyote and these other traditional characters. And I think that really puts a nice touch to it. It really like makes them very relatable. So just again, really,
Oh,
really great job.
thanks,
We have
man.
to take yeah, go ahead. We have to take a short break, but just quickly respond. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think about my reader a lot, and the reader I imagine is my grandfather. He read all these dime store Western novels, and so I would like for my own family who doesn't read that many books to be able to open this book and, excuse me, not feel alienated or not feel like it's accessible to them.
All right. Julian, we are going to take a short break. We'll come back and continue this conversation. And to our many listeners who are tuning into the show right now live, please give us a call. If you'd like to ask a question to Julian Brave Noisecat, or you have a comment to share, maybe you have already had a chance to read We Survived the Night or any of his other work, give us a call. You can join this conversation. That's why we have the show live and we have phone lines to connect with our listeners. The number, of course, is 1-800-996-2848. Once again, 1-800-996-2848. What are you waiting for? Pick up that phone. Give us a call. What were once intimate family celebrations to honor ancestors has become an international festival that blends cultures. Dia de los Muertos is rooted in traditional Aztec and Mayan respect for dead relatives. Its popularity beyond its Mexican indigenous beginnings is an opportunity to educate others. We'll hear more about it on the next Native America Calling.
The Association on American Indian Affairs invites all to Tribal Museums Day, December 6th through December 12th. Tribal museums may offer no-cost or reduced admission, gift shop discounts, art markets, and live cultural demonstrations. Tribal Museums Day honors diverse Native nations as the experts of their own cultures. You can find a map of tribal museums and more at indian-affairs.org/Tribal Museums Day. The association supports this show.
Thank you for listening to Native America Calling. We're speaking today with Julian Brave Noisecat. His first book, We Survived the Night, which fuses memoir, Native politics, and traditional stories. You can contribute to this conversation with a comment or a question. Just call us, 1-800-996-2848. That number is also 1-800-99-NATIVE. And you can also continue the dialogue on our website, nativeamericacalling.com, and our social media pages, Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, Threads. Julian, what's one of the really cool elements of this book is how you fuse these different concepts, the memoir, the personal stories, the family history, and then you delve into political events, historical events, both in Canada and the United States. And then you have these traditional stories and you just kind of go back and forth. We get a few chapters, hearing about your dad and your upbringing and your mom. and then we'll dive into a political issue of some sort, either historical or contemporary. How did you kind of pick those stories and those issues, and how did you weave them all together so you have such a consistent flow and just such a good readable book?
Well, first, thank you so much. That's very kind of you. I would say firstly that you used the word weave, and that was actually a very purposeful metaphor that I myself used to think about the narrative of the book. My people, especially the Stadtling side of my family, weaving is the considered like the highest art form among our people. No offense to my father, who's a carver, but in our lineage, we consider the our most prized possessions to be the baskets of like my great grandmother Kikia, whose tax name was Annie Jim, or her mother, Julianne Kraus Peters, who has work actually right here in Vancouver at the Museum of Anthropology at the University of British Columbia. And I went and checked that work out actually a number of months ago. And I think about the book, which combines personal story, family history, reporting, oral history, and what people might consider criticism, but I just kind of describe as having an opinion about things, into a woven narrative that is trying to weave back together a sense of wholeness for myself and for this indigenous world that has been, broken by colonization, but that is still here and still incredibly beautiful and coming back together and rising again. So weaving is definitely, throughout the book, I'm working with cultural forms from my own people's way, whether you look at the title, the coyote stories, or the woven nature of the entire narrative. You asked about which stories I chose to focus on in the reporting. I've spent the last decade reporting on Indian country for lots of newspapers and magazines. And, I find myself personally drawn to stories that I feel like will teach me something new about indigeneity, about native life across Canada and the United States. I didn't want to write like an Indian 101 book. Those books exist. That's not really what I am interested in, because I think that Indigenous life is really interesting. I think that it can help us understand broader parts of North American current affairs, history, and culture. It can get at universal questions like our relationship to family, place, land, culture, tradition. Um, I really wanted to look at stories and choose to tell stories that I thought had not really been told or known, and that revealed things about how Native people remain core, not just to the story of Indian country, but to the story of North America more broadly. And I use the continent as the geographic unit of the story purposefully because this is a story that also decenters the nation state. It is not about Native people vis-a-vis the United States or Indigenous peoples vis-a-vis Canada. This is about Indigenous peoples, our relationship to one another, to ourselves, and to our land, placing us at the center of the story of a continent that was and is and has been ours for a whole heck of a lot longer than it was, Canada or the United States.
Right. Julian, you describe yourself as a student of Salish language and history, and of course, language is a big part of the book. You have a lot of words, a lot of place names. When did you start to really try to study the language, and where are you at in the process?
Yeah, I would say that I'm more of a student of Salish art and history, but the language is a big piece of that. I started learning language when I was in college. I spent the summers living on the Cannon Lake Res, learning Secwepemctsín, our language from my kia, my grandmother, who is one of only two remaining fluent speakers on our res now. It's her and her sister. And every time I would sit down for a language lesson, I remember my kia would go fetch a coffee mug from the cupboard that said Chukwi Nook on it, which is the way that we give the morning greeting in Secwepemctsín. And it actually does not mean good morning. It literally translates to you survived the night. And ever since I learned that, I often wondered what it was for my ancestors to greet one another in the day with the simple yet profound acknowledgement that they'd made it to another morning. What did that mean in the winter of 1863, for example, when 2/3 of our nation died of smallpox? What did it mean in the mornings after the children were taken away to the Indian residential schools? And what kind of twisted humor put "You survived the night" on the coffee mug of my grandmother, who was a survivor of one of those schools and who is now one of the last remaining fluent speakers of that language? I think that there's so much in that gets at our sensibility as Indigenous peoples. There's poetry, there's social commentary, there's like a sort of wry, dark humor. And I think throughout the book, I turn to my own people's language and culture and sense of who we are to tell our stories and to try to bring this really lively way of seeing the world and engaging with it back to life on the page in a way that I haven't seen it done before in nonfiction.
All right, Julian, we have a caller on the line. This is Mike, who is listening in Buffalo Springs, New Mexico on station KGLP. Hello, Mike. You're on the air.
Sean. I was just listening to the beginning of your guest's talk about his coyote dad, and I was just wondering and I was thinking, couldn't that be the same? Like I could use that same title for my mom, because all my life I really knew nothing about her or who she was, other than that she was my mother. She left in 1960 when I was just about 3 years old, and never saw her again until 67. And then I was kind of puzzled as to who this woman was in that coffin. And that was the last I seen of her or even knew of her. So I kind of like think about that, and I was like, would that kind of be some way my coyote mother in some
Mike,
sense,
yeah. Yeah, Julian, what are your
Yeah, why
thoughts there?
not? Well, firstly, Yate, my Dene is not very good, but I've spent a little time on the Navajo Nation. Yate Abini, I think is how you guys say good morning. Thank you so much for calling in. Yeah, I think that the coyote tradition in my people's sort of account of it is a very capacious tradition. It's a very broad tradition. I think it can get at a lot of different things. Different things about our loved ones and our family and complicated family dynamics, because the coyote was a very complicated ancestor to have. And I think it also can get at a lot of different parts of our, culture and environmental and all these sorts of other histories. The coyote stories are often also relaying important parts of our people's past that need to be handed down, teachings that need to be handed down. In that sense, I think that the coyote stories, which, were once told by indigenous peoples all the way from Central America to Western Canada, this is probably one of the largest bodies of oral literature that ever existed in human history, are a really remarkable set of narratives and works with ideas that deserve to endure and to be taken seriously. It's just that, the humanities, broadly speaking, which are controlled by, colonial institutions that are often named after colonizers, like the one that I went to for undergrad, Columbia University, which is named after the poetic form for Columbus. They teach these courses on the quote unquote great works of Western civilization, and do that at the exclusion of these great works of indigenous wisdom and knowledge and oral literature that endured for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, and that I think demand to be taken seriously. So yeah, I think that I appreciate anybody who picks up these stories and engages with them and sees how they are relevant to their own life and family and culture.
Well, Julian, now that our caller Mike has begin the conversation with regard to mothers, not just fathers. Let's talk about your own mother. And she certainly was not a Coyote mom. She was very involved in your life. She essentially raised you after your
Still
dad
is, yeah.
left. Still is. And she's not indigenous, but she really made it a point to keep you connected to your culture. What was your reason for that when you now that reflecting back, and where do you think that commitment comes from? Because at one point you mentioned an aunt who was very opposed to what your mom was doing.
Yeah, I think that my mom would describe it as instinctual. So my mom, as I said earlier, is an Irish Jewish New Yorker. She grew up in Westchester County, New York, and she always felt a little bit out of an outsider within her own family and cultural context, I guess. Her father was an Irish Catholic guy who went to seminary and then became a literary journalist, which is like just about the most Irish career path you can possibly imagine. And her mother was an orphan who was partially Jewish by ancestry, who worked as a secretary. And after my grandfather's magazine folded, it was a magazine called Look magazine that was open until like the 60s, 70s. Um, the family had to subsist on my grandmother's pink collar secretary salary, and so my mom, was part of this sort of like intellectual New York scene, where your sort of sense of worth and belonging was derived from your connection to the intelligentsia, I guess. And she didn't really vibe with that. And, even though she herself excelled at school and went to some pretty great colleges and universities, she, I think, was always trying to get out of and get away from that kind of a world. And so, when my dad wandered into the bar where she was working as a bartender after graduating from college, he took the golden feast ladle earring out of his left lobe and gave it to her, and she poured him drinks all night. And that was, I guess, how I came to be. And after he left, she made a point of keeping me connected to his family and my culture. She would drive me all the way to the Cannon Lake Indian Reserve, which is 1,000 miles and a whole country away from Oakland, California, where I grew up. She would bring me down to the Intertribal Friendship House in East Oakland, one of the oldest urban Indian community centers in the country. She even learned how to bead so that I could have my own regalia to dance at powwows. And to this day, she's still my first reader and editor. And that for those reasons, the book is actually dedicated to her.
All right. And we have a caller on the line, but quickly I want to ask you, Julian, that one aunt of your mom's relative who thought it was not a good idea that your mom have you involved with your native culture. Do you have a relationship with that person now? And if so, how is it?
I do, yeah. It's my mom's relationship to her family is a little bit more complicated. Um, I'm definitely not as close to them as I am to my father's family, which is, I think, one of the many ironies of our sort of unusual family arrangement. But I think that people usually mean well. I think that what my mom chose to do by most sort of standards is a kind of unusual thing. To make the effort to keep your kid connected to a father who abandoned him and his family, especially at a time at an era where understandings of native life were perhaps maybe not quite as progressive as they are now.
Mm-hmm.
It was a not usual set of parenting decisions, and so I don't necessarily hold it against my aunt who had a different opinion. I am very grateful though that my mom didn't listen to her.
I'll bet. Let's go to the phones. We have Gary, who is listening in Espanola, New Mexico, on station KUNM. Hi, Gary. You're on the air.
Oh, CEO, bro. I'm glad to be with you, friends. And I'm blended Celtic and my citizenship in the Cherokee Nation. And it is an interesting combination that many, many people share. I was wondering about any correlations between, like, the Coyote stories and Ravenmocker, who can certainly be a trickster and can be many things.
All right, Gary, thank you. That's a great question. Yeah, go ahead, Julian.
Raven Mocker, is that the Cherokee version of the trickster?
Stem as push. Stem as push.
I'm not quite sure how we feel this one here, Julian.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just say that there are parallel figures across many different cultures. In the Northwest, there's also the figure of Raven among the people of the coast, who is also a trickster, although he also appears in some of the coyote stories, like the Origin of Death story that I recount at the beginning of the book. The way that story is told by the people of the Nicola Valley, the area around what's now Merritt, British Columbia, is as a negotiation between our trickster Coyote and the coastal trickster Raven. And I think that there are lots of different trickster figures all throughout Indian country that have and the world beyond that have similarities to Coyote. There is something interestingly in oral culture, the trickster kind of figure seems to recur again and again and again. And then when we switch to a more literary culture, we seem to lose touch with the trickster, even though I would argue that now we are looking out at the world, and it is a world wherein there are lots of tricksters and tricks that are happening all the time.
The book is titled We Survived the Night, written by Julian Brave Noisecat. It just came out, published this month. Give us a call if you want to join the conversation. We still have a lot more time with Julian Brave Noisecat. 1-800-996-2848. Phone lines are open.
Support by the American Indian College Fund. The American Indian College Fund provides millions of dollars of scholarships to thousands of Native students every year. Tribal citizens of every age and experience are eligible. The deadline for applications is May 31st, and you can find everything you need to apply at collegefund.org. That's collegefund.org, or by phone at 800-766-FUND. Education is the answer.
You're listening to Native America Calling. Let's continue our conversation with Julian Brave Noisecat. We're talking about his new book, his past work as a journalist and political strategist, and much more. Join us with comments or questions by calling 1-800-996-2848. 1-800-996-2848. Julian, we're definitely going to talk, about some of the issues in the book and some of your other projects as well. But I do want to ask you about one more character from the book, your mom's former partner. His name, Coco, an Apache man that you and your mom both met at the Intertribal Friendship House in the Mission District of San Francisco. And he encourages you to powwow dance, and he has a mixed influence on you as well. Tell us more about his role in the book, and even now, years later, his impact in your life.
Yeah, after my father left, my mom got into another relationship with a Native man who we met at the Intertribal Friendship House in Oakland. Actually, it wasn't in San Francisco. And he was a bit of a lovable trickster figure himself. He came up to her when they first met and said, "So what tribe are you from?" at the Intertribal Friendship House, and she went, "The white one." And he was a really remarkable man. Is a really remarkable man. He is a fluent speaker of Apaches from the White Mountain Apache Reservation. He's really knowledgeable about the culture and ceremonies of his people and others. Canyon Records used to send him CDs to review. Like they distribute like Northern Cree and some of those like big drum groups and stuff like that. So they were a major distributor of Native music. He knew a lot about Native culture and history. At the powwows in the Bay Area, he could sit at just about any drum at the powwow, which is not everyone can do that. And at the same time, he had his own traumas and his own complexities. When we met him, he had just gotten out of out of prison. He would later return to prison, and he had a history of domestic violence that eventually came into our home. And so at the same time as he was, essentially a second father figure to me who helped me stay connected to my culture at a moment when that thing could have been broken. This is a man who taught me how to throw a two-seam fastball and how to dance powwow, and who made some of my first powwow regalia. Um, he also imperiled my mother, and I write about that complexity in the book, and still have a lot of love for him despite what happened.
I think a lot of people can relate to that. There was a person in my life who was dating a family member of mine, and he was physically abusive to that person, but that person taught me so much. That guy taught me so much, and I learned so much from him. And we love conflicted people sometimes. We love people that are not perfect. So I thought that was just a really interesting relationship that you profiled in the book, Julian. And I also want to talk more about your education, because you mentioned earlier you went to Columbia University and you were a Rhodes Scholar finalist, and you really took that upon yourself as a challenge to represent Native people in the world of high level, high profile academia. Tell us more about your overall experience at the university, and then also your studies abroad.
Native people, we often talk about having to walk in two worlds, and I have definitely had to do that. I mean, I have two worlds in my literal DNA. And I think that part of my way I imagined myself getting revenge on the white kids who had two dads who I went to school with in elementary school, and who I always felt a little bit less than for those reasons and others, was to excel academically, is to beat them at school, and those sorts of measures of success. I guess I was also kind of part of the generation wherein there was still a strong belief in the American meritocracy. I sense that is very much dying. And so, I excelled in school. I got into all the colleges I applied to. I chose to go to Columbia University in New York City, a school named after the poetic version of Columbus. I had an interview for the Rhodes Scholarship, wherein one of my interviewers asked me why Indians don't pay taxes, which was a very ironic thing for one of the wealthiest people in the continent to be asking of someone who comes from people who are not the wealthiest in the continent. Let's put it that way. And I ended up anyways getting a scholarship to go study at Oxford, because I thought that at the time I wanted to become a historian. I thought I might go get a PhD or something like that. And I encountered an institution that was very small C conservative, and felt very alienated at various turns in my, path through, the ivory towers of academia. And to cope, interestingly, I chose to drink. I had decided, I had from a very young age thought that I was going to define myself as the exact opposite of my dad in so many different ways. And yet, if I look back on it now, in many ways, I was following in his footsteps, going as far away as I could imagine from, my home and my people, and drinking to cope with, the stresses and pains of life, and the feelings of inadequacy, and lack of belonging and connection, and all those sorts of things. And I also struggled with my relationships to women in a way that was not only similar to my father, but probably even more similar to my grandfather, a man who my grandfather had 19 kids that I could name, with 7 different women. And so I very nearly lost myself, I would say, when in my sort of sojourn through the East Coast and these elite institutions. And it was really actually the making of Sugarcane and the writing of this book, We Survived the Night, that brought me back home and brought me back to my people.
It's important to note also, Julian, that both you and your father you no longer drink, and that sobriety is a topic that you write about quite extensively. What's your message to anyone listening right now who might be struggling with an addiction issue?
Listen, I don't think that it's a one size fit all kind of thing. I think that we all have our own journeys with respect to our uses of alcohol and various substances, and I'm not saying that it's impossible to have a healthy relationship to them. And in fact, in the New York Times Magazine, I wrote about on the day that the book came out, I wrote about how me and my dad would hang out and smoke weed and talk about stuff to sort of like heal from our shared traumas. So I'm definitely not like a teetotaler per se. But what I will say is that everybody who I know who has chosen to get sober, virtually all of them will tell you like it was the best decision of their life. And I'm the same. I think that choosing to quit drinking was the best decision of my life. One that I am grateful for every single day. And I have nightmares still that I accidentally have a drink or that I like break my sobriety, which I think can give you a real sense of how important it is for me and how healthy and healing it has been. There were moments when I was in my depths where I really put myself and other people in harm's way and was becoming someone who I really did not want to be.
Julian, you mentioned dating, and you very openly write about your worries about having a child with a non-native partner, and I think that's another issue that a lot of Native people struggle with. Is that still something that you think about?
Um, Not as much, because I'm with a wonderful Shimshan woman. Actually, she's from four different nations, so she's extra sacred. She's Shimshan, Nishka, Tlingit, and Skokomish. But I do write about in the book because this is in a certain way like a young man's book, or I wrote it when I was in my late 20s and early 30s. And one of the things that I think we face as Native people is, we are the only people in North America who still have our racial purity legislated by the government. In the United States, different tribes have blood quantum rules. In Canada, there is a federal law called the Indian Act that defines who is and is not Indian in the eyes of the federal government here in Canada. And under that law, there's kind of two designations of Indians. There's what's called a 6'1" Indian and a 6'2" Indian. Not in height, unfortunately. I'm actually 5'11". But my father is what's considered a 6'1" Indian, which means that both of his parents were Indians under the Indian Act. I am a 6'2" Indian because my father is a 6'1" Indian, and my mother is not an Indian under the Indian Act, which means that unless I have children with someone who's considered an Indian under the Indian Act, my kids will not be counted as Indian in the eyes of the federal law of Canada. They could still be a member of the Cannon Lake Band, the band that I'm a member of, because our band defines membership as being a quarter. But after that, all bets are off. And so, it is a very real thing that as Native people, we have to ask ourselves about our cultural, our legal, survival at every on every first date. It's a kind of crazy position to inhabit, and one that, to the best of my knowledge, I mean, other people have similar things about dating inside and outside of their ethnicity and culture, but for other people, to my understanding, it is not a literal question of the survival of your people and the perpetuation of your rights.
Let's talk about Deb Haaland. You write extensively about her political career and also your role in suggesting her as Interior Secretary. And I understand you're going to be appearing in Albuquerque soon with Deb Haaland. What do you think her legacy is now as the first Native person to lead the Department of Interior? And what do you see for her going in the future?
I think that Deb is a generational leader in not just Indian country, but in the United States politics more broadly. I would say that, I mean, listen, the Democratic Party is in a pretty bad spot lately. And I would say that Deb Haaland is undoubtedly one of the most talented politicians in American politics and in the Democratic Party. And I sincerely hope that she, has a strong showing in the race for governor of New Mexico. I met her when she was first running for Congress. I, at the time, was a young writer, environmental activist living in DC. And, I saw the story of, like many others at the time, a Native woman who went to the camps in the path of the Dakota Access Pipeline and cooked green chili stew and tortillas for the water protectors as an incredibly inspiring story. One that, I hoped would carry our people to new political heights of representation. And so during the Biden race for president, I I did something that I didn't think would go anywhere, but I put Deb's name on a sort of fantasy football style list of potential progressive cabinet picks for a would-be Biden administration. And interestingly, it actually went somewhere, as we now know, and she became the first ever Native American cabinet secretary, even though she was not the go-to choice of someone like Biden, even though we had to convince, Nancy Pelosi to let her get out of the House of Representatives when the Democrats had a pretty slim majority there. And even though we had to, once she was nominated, we had to, get her past a razor-thin margin in the Senate, which included, getting the backing of a number of Republicans, most prominently Lisa Murkowski of Alaska. And I think that what was truly remarkable and remains truly remarkable about the former Secretary of Interior, Deb Haaland, is that she was probably the only politician, maybe ever in history, to be able to count like progressive activists like the Sunrise Movement, as well as like congressional Republicans like Don Young and Tom Cole and Lisa Murkowski as her as among her backers, as among her supporters. What a wild array of the political spectrum that, especially nowadays, feels like it would be impossible to see those kinds of groups agreeing on something as they did when they agreed that she should become the first ever Native American Interior Secretary.
Julian, I wish we had more time. We're going to have to wind up the show here pretty soon, but I want to ask you about the book tour. And I know you've had a busy couple of years with Sugarcane documentary and now your debut book. What's been the feedback so far, and what kind of events do you have planned coming up in the next few weeks?
Well, you brought up Albuquerque, so we should shout out Albuquerque. I'll be in person at 4803 Rio Grande Boulevard North in West Los Ranchos to Albuquerque. It's an off-site event with Bookworks, Los Poblanos Historic Inn and Organic. Oh, wait, sorry, that's where I'm staying. Just kidding. I'm trying to read my schedule aloud here on air. And I have a few more events tonight in Vancouver, BC, tomorrow in Whistler, on Saturday in Point Reyes, California, Monday in Albuquerque, as we mentioned, and then Tuesday at the Dallas Museum of Art. From there, the schedule, I'm still on the road quite a bit, but it goes to more like 2 events or so a week. And you can follow along on my Instagram at jnoisecat is where I post most often. The Penguin Random House site for We Survived the Night also has my tour events. And if you're interested in having me come talk about the book, if there's a way for me to figure out how to get my travel and everything out to wherever you happen to be, the thing that matters to me most is that I get this book into as many readers' hands as possible. And I'm really grateful to everyone who's showed up so far. It means
right on. Julian, thank you so much, and just best of luck to you going forward, okay? It's been an honor to interview you.
Thank you all so much, and we'll see you again.
Okay, and the event is at Los Poblanos in Albuquerque. It's sponsored by Bookworks, but it is sold out, just so listeners understand it. It is a sold-out event. And that's it. We're going to have to wrap up this show and our conversation with Julian Brave Noisecat. But please, listeners, join us again tomorrow as we look at the indigenous origins of the Mexican tradition Dia de los Muertos, or Day of the Dead. I'm Sean Spruce. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Support provided by Amerind. Amerind is 100% tribally owned and partners with tribes and their businesses to provide affordable commercial insurance coverage, protect tribal sovereignty, and strengthen Native American communities by helping to keep dollars in Indian country. Information about property, liability, commercial auto, and workers' comp available at amerind.com. That's AMERIND.com.
Buju gikaganawen dagon jabwate shimagoyen. Ganoje no kida nishinabe akwazi wigamigung jigikendaman dawajge ijichigayen jabwate shimagoyen gedudu shing. Nawaj jigikendaman mawadishawain healthcare.gov/coverage gema ganoj 1-800-318-2596. Gaunde Nagadeg, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services.
Native America Calling is produced in the Annenberg National Native Voice Studios in Albuquerque, New Mexico by Koahnic Broadcast Corporation, a Native nonprofit media organization. Funding is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting with support from the Public Radio Satellite Service. Music is by Brent Michael Davids. Native Voice One, the Native American Radio Network.